If they deregulate in 1990, we could end up with a handful of companies owning every broadcasting outlet in the country. That's a warning from 1984 about what was to come, so let's talk about Clear Channel.
Clear Channel FM. Kiss my ass cheek.
Back in the mid-90s, there was a Texas-based media company slowly and carefully picking up new radio stations to add to its repertoire. From a small operation running about 10 stations around San Antonio, they had grown to encompass more and more of Texas, shooting north of 40 stations in 1995. But in the next 8 years, they would add more than 1,100 stations to their portfolio, homogenizing and bulldozing everything in their path. Welcome to the age of Clear Channel Communications. Let me reiterate that. 1,240 stations in 2003, up from 40 in 1996. Just as you can do a cross-country road trip and only stop at Starbucks and McDonald's, you can now do so while only listening to stations owned and operated by Clear Channel, well, now iHeartRadio. In many markets, you can spin the dial all day and hit only Clear Channel, else a Viacom or Univision syndicated channel. Your chances of hitting on a locally owned and operated radio station are vanishingly slim, and that has real costs. This is the story of the Telecoms Act of 1996, a death sentence for radio as a medium, but great for a few big companies. This is the story of the smaller competition, shrinking into the corners and fighting for scraps. This is the story of the biggest, baddest company who took full advantage to plunge the dagger into the heart of our connection to music in our communities. So let's start back in the 1950s, when the FCC put together rules ensuring no company could own more than 7 broadcast stations of any one type. In 1984, the rule was relaxed again, up to 12 stations, and was further relaxed in 1990, allowing Clear Channel and a few others to own up to 40 stations. Clearly the big were getting bigger, but 40 is a long way from 1,200. Clear Channel were pushing for big reform. They saw the potential of their model and went about forcing the hand of politicians to allow them to continue their growth. It was the passage of 1996's Telecoms Act that opened the floodgates. A very sexy and exciting sounding law. It was wide-ranging, but the important piece was this, of its regulations by eliminating any provisions limiting the number of AM or FM broadcast stations which may be owned or controlled by one entity nationally. Commercial stations, a party may own, operate, and control up to 8 commercial stations. After this law passed, Clear Channel almost immediately snapped up 49 additional stations. And then, after a $6.5 billion acquisition of Jaguar Communications, that brought their portfolio up to 450 stations. It was then that private equity dug into their pockets and gave Clear Channel the cash required to, in less than 7 years, become one of the biggest media conglomerates on the planet. If you're trying to keep track at home, at their peak, Clear Channel had 1,240 radio stations. They had 41 TV stations. They had one of the nation's leading live entertainment companies, and they had over 750,000 billboards. But it wasn't just the company's scale that made the country turn against them so forcefully. It was their way of doing business that would cut the heart out of radio and indeed make them so hated that they had to entirely rebrand. Broadly speaking, their goal is to buy stations and improve efficiency in 2 key ways. Firstly, they can run sales at a regional or national level instead of having to handle individual stations. And secondly, they could syndicate their own shows across multiple stations. Sure, this would reduce local advertising and local programming, but the goal was to move a little more generic for the good of efficiency, reads their bottom line. They even argued that the alternative to these cuts was to close the stations entirely, painting themselves as the good guys in this equation. Of course, a tale that will be familiar if you've been watching private equity do its job more recently is that good for the bottom line isn't good enough. It always needs to be better. You can scrape the insides out of a business and funnel that to the owners. As long as profits move in the right direction, to hell with the rest of it. And that is exactly what happened. Now we're going to do something I never thought I'd do on this channel. We're going to talk about Minot, North Dakota. Minot is a town of around 40,000 people, and in 2002, a train carrying toxic fertilizer derailed close by. Toxic fumes were on their way into the town, and they needed to warn residents to stay inside as quickly as possible. We have a system for that. It's called the Emergency Alert System. Nowadays you can text everyone, but back in 2002, the primary communication was over the airwaves. And so they called the broadcasters, except 6 of the 7 stations were owned by Clear Channel and were effectively run from out of state. There was a siren that went off. Everybody turned on their radio to try to hear what was going on. And there was nothing on the radio but oldies or country music. Nothing about what was happening, the threat that was coming to their community. To hell with the rest of it. Not that Clear Channel were alone, and as Lydia Camarillo tells it, having an oligopoly was almost as bad as having a monopoly. Local and minority voices were being squeezed out, and after consolidation, there wasn't a real alternative to the big boys. The number of television stations owned by minorities has declined in the last 3 years. In San Antonio, the top 10 stations are owned by 3 conglomerate companies: Clear Channel, Fox, and Univision. To tell it more specifically, Robert Short, who owned a station prior to Clear Channel's domination of his market, tells us exactly what the African American community in Syracuse lost. They don't line up special programs to get kids into basketball games. They don't have anyone going to schools. They do 0 community work. They don't give our community a voice. They don't want us to have a voice. They just want us so they can sell ads. To hell with the rest of it. People were harmed by that link to the community being severed through the push to generic programming. But they were also harmed in arguably more subtle ways, with less programming taking place at individual stations. Playlists started to be standardized and stripped of a unique aesthetic or style that used to permeate radio. I'll let Ray Benson tell the rest of this one. When I started making records in the early 70s, things were a lot different. Stations had larger playlists that were sprinkled with records from independent, small, national, and regional labels. People got to hear a variety of music, and regional stars were made all over the country. To hell with the rest of it. By 2004, the vitriol leveled against Clear Channel was far too much for the company to power through. They announced plans to carry more local programming, invited independent musicians to start submitting music directly through their website. They cut down on commercial minutes to try to drag their public image back from the brink. Really, none of that was enough, and by late 2005, their corporate debt was becoming a struggle for them on Wall Street too, at more than $6.6 billion. I'm not saying this to generate sympathy for Clear Channel, but to highlight how badly their aggressive strategy worked. It harmed local stations, it harmed musicians, it harmed local businesses, and then when the scores were tallied in the mid-2000s, it wasn't even working out for them. They eventually broke up some of their interests into other companies and rebranded their radio efforts to iHeartRadio. See, Clear Channel's still floating about, not nearly as powerful as they once were, but the scar that they left on the radio landscape is one that likely won't ever heal. This is a story of the monopoly that nearly killed radio. Thanks for watching. I don't know if I've done anything else quite like this yet, so let me know what you think. I certainly want to do more stuff talking about broader subjects like this, so let me know what you reckon.